Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut. This biweekly virtual series features AARP staff and volunteers, as well as decision makers from across Connecticut. My name is John Erlingheuser, and I'm the Advocacy and Community Outreach Director for AARP Connecticut, and I'm your host this morning. In our conversations, we discuss a variety of topics affecting Connecticut's older residents. Today, we're joined by AARP Connecticut volunteer Tim Ryan. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
And we're also joined by Connecticut Secretary of State Denise Merrill. And today we're going to discuss expanding voting options for all Connecticutans. So, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate everything you're doing on behalf of the voters in the state of Connecticut. And I think I'll start off by just simply asking you, so folks have a better understanding about your office and what you do. Tell us a little bit about the Secretary of State's office and its duties, not only with elections, but in general.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks, John. Great to be here once again with AARP members. I've done these things a number of times for a number of years. I've been in office almost 30 years now. I don't like to tell people that often, but for this crowd, I guess I'll let you know. I was 17 years in the General Assembly. John Erlingheuser was a student at UConn when I first knew him. And I did represent Eastern Connecticut in those days for a long time. And then I became Secretary of State almost 10 years ago now. In 2010, I was elected, and I'm now in my third term. So the Secretary of State's office was this kind of sleepy office, sort of seen as a stepping stone to higher office for many years. In all states, Secretaries of State mostly, not always, mostly oversee elections. That's what they're most known for, although it's really, in Connecticut at least, pretty limited role in a way, because elections are administered at the towns. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, because I get lots and lots of calls and emails every year about what am I going to do about the lists? What am I going to do about, the fact that somebody didn't get to vote or wanted to vote or whatever. And that's all handled by local election officials. Every town has 2 registrars, one from each party, and a town clerk, and they each have different roles in elections. So that's kind of my most famous role, but it's actually a very small part of my office. I think the Secretary of State's office is almost like a super town clerk's office. We do all kinds of things. We file lots of things. We used to laughingly call ourselves the file cabinet of the state. And it was true for a long time. It's really different now. We've got a lot more technology. We register all the businesses in the state, for example. And so we have a pretty good fix on, I would say, economic development activity in some ways. And now we're much more able to tell folks what's going on in whatever town or region of the state, for example. We also put out every year the state blue book, and people ask me, what is that? It's this wonderful registry. We're still printing it on paper, but it's also online. Every function in the state. And if you want to know what the state bird is, for example, you can find it in the blue book. But if you want to know who your state representative is, you can find it in the blue book, or for that matter, the people on your town council. So we publish that every year. We have a lot of other publications for the state, and we also house things like the electronic regulation system. So we're getting into more and more technology. Right now, we're working on something we call the Business One Stop. You start a business in Connecticut, you're going to be able to go to one portal in our office, log in, get a login number, and be able to access all kinds of services regarding your business all in one place. So, there's a bunch of other things we do, but I think I'll stop there. It's a long.
No, that's a great overview. And I don't, the reason I ask you to kind of expand on it, even though we're going to talk about voting options in Connecticut, I don't think most people realize the scope that your office has and the variety of other things that you're responsible for in the state of Connecticut. So having said that, let's jump into the main topic for the morning, and that is elections and expanded voting elections. So a lot of discussion. I know recently there was a public hearing on some resolutions to the state constitution that would change the way people vote in Connecticut. That would allow, in addition to our voting on election day, allow people to vote early in person, which we currently can't do in Connecticut, and also have no excuse absentee balloting. So I guess my big question in that regard is, why is it that we have to go to a constitutional amendment process and bring it to the voters rather than just by having the legislature make those changes to bring us in line with the majority of other states in the country?
Great question, and one I explain almost every day, and it is complicated. So basically, Connecticut is the only state left that has provisions in its state constitution about exactly, you can only vote on that Tuesday in November, for example, and there are limited excuses and enumerated excuses. There are like 1, 2, 3, 4 spelled out right in the state constitution. And those excuses probably made sense in 1834 when they were passed as part of the 1818 Constitution in Connecticut. But we saw this year that they no longer service us when certain other things happen. And 2020 was an amazing year in elections, as in everything else. And we learned a lot. But we were really hampered by the fact that the state constitution is pretty immutable. To change it, you have to go through several steps, and it has to go on a ballot. All the residents in the state have to vote for or against the measure, and then, only then, can you implement those changes if you want to make them. So it's really difficult. It's a long process. I've been suggesting this for years because I knew this day would come when there would be no flexibility. Here we are in an emergency situation where people could not or didn't want to go to the polling place because they were afraid they might contract the virus. And they were right to be nervous about that because we were under an emergency order from the governor right all the way through 2020, really starting right about March last year. It's hard to remember where we were. So that's why this all came out this year. Once again, It's been an issue for years, but this is the year I think all the state realizes that, wow, we're one of only 7 states left that don't do these things. So let's join the rest of the country.
Tim, why don't you ask the next question?
Yeah, so many people I talk to think these changes that were put in place were a permanent fix, and they're looking forward to doing it in the future. And that's apparently not the case. You have to change the Constitution. What does that look like time-wise, and when could people see relief from this, I guess?
Yes, I'm very worried about that, to be honest, because of course we don't want to mislead people. And I think now that they've experienced it, you're right, everyone wants it again, and they're thinking that it's still in place. It is not. Those changes were only for the 2020 election. And so now to get those changes, particularly, let's talk about absentee ballots first. So in the state constitution, it says you can get an absentee ballot if you're unable to get to the polls due to sickness. That's one of the, quote, excuses you need. But what we did this year was we allowed people to get an absentee ballot in this emergency situation if you had kind of like were worried about sickness, or you could get sick if you went to the polls. That's the exception that we kind of finessed, if you will, this year. To make that a permanent part of our statutes, we need to get that restrictive language just out of the state constitution. It doesn't belong there. It really belongs in statute, like every other state has it. And then you can make the changes. The legal and representatives and senators can make the changes needed over time. And there will be more. I'm convinced, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. To do that, we would need to pass the resolution that we have had introduced this year. So it's Resolution 58, House Joint Resolution 58, would allow there to be what we call no excuse absentee ballots. So in other words, we would just remove the restrictions from the state constitution and leave them in statute where they can be changed. That takes in order to get it on the next statewide ballot, which is the earliest we could do it, would be in 2022. So, but even to do that, we need a supermajority of members of both houses, House and Senate in the state, to vote for it. And as you can imagine, that means it needs to be bipartisan. Democrats cannot pass this alone. And frankly, it has not been a partisan issue in many places in the country until now. And so we'll see. We have had some Republican support in the past, but we would need 75% of all the state representatives and senators to vote yes this year in order to get it on the ballot in 2022.
And Madam Secretary, that's a great point. And, AARP, we have almost 600,000 members in the state. We're nonpartisan. Our membership, being as large as it is, looks like the state as a whole. And our members overwhelmingly support these measures.
Right.
And, really are looking forward to getting them passed. And one of the things I in the recent public hearing on these issues that came up was, well, why aren't we doing the constitutional amendment in more specificity, right? I mean, which is interesting to me because, right, we have representative government and, we want legislators to make changes. But from what you're telling me, we're just making Constitution permissive of us to have the debate about what changes we should or shouldn't make. Is that not kind of right?
That's exactly right. I know there was a lot of conversation at the public hearing about, well, why aren't we saying how many days of early voting we want? We didn't really talk about the other resolution, which is about giving us more days of voting in person. That's the other thing Connecticut doesn't have that 40 other states are already doing. But yes, that's right. All we're doing is permitting those changes to happen. The language about all the way we vote is still in statute where it belongs. And so to make any serious change, any of these changes, decide how many days of early voting you want, for example, or decide exactly what checks and balances you want in place for an absentee ballot, or whatever your issue is, that would all be in statute, but it would still remain exactly as it is. As actually, frankly, was true this year. We made very few changes in the way we do absentee balloting. It's just that there were a lot more of them. And so that created the consternation where the clerks were feeling pretty overwhelmed by the fact that they were going to have this huge number of absentee ballots. It actually turned out to be quite manageable. Yeah. And it worked out beautifully. I think we had the smoothest election that I can remember.
Well, Madam Secretary, as you know, I used to be a registrar of voters and, presidential elections. And I was there for, I think, 4 presidential elections. And that was where we all would, our hair on the back of our necks would go up because it was such a high turnout election and so much at stake up and down the ballot. And, my former deputy is the registrar in the municipality I served in. So I spoke with him, prior to the election and after the election. And, they were done sooner on election night with their process, faster than any time we had ever been done before. With that higher, there was something like 5 times the amount of absentee ballots in the municipality I served than there had been in the past. And yet with all of that, they were able to have their process all wrapped up relatively quickly. So how many states again have like in-person early voting and no excuse absentee balloting? Do you have that information?
Yes, actually about 43, if you count Washington, D.C., which we do in this way. We are by far the most restrictive state in the country.
So who do we line up with that doesn't do this? That's always an interesting stat.
I think I recall, let's see, I don't have the list, but it's Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and New Hampshire, which is the only one that's kind of interesting. But they have other issues. But anyway, yes.
Well, we appreciate that. So Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tim, for our next question.
Yeah, since this is going to be like a multi-year thing, were there other kinds of measures that you adopted this year for the 2020 election that, made it run better, that you can do without changing the Constitution, that you can keep the momentum going, the improvements coming?
Yes. Well, part of it, I hate to say it, but it's always about money, but it was about money. We had $5 million in CARES Act funding to help the towns facilitate the election. Now, we wouldn't have to do that every year. I mean, as John said, presidential years are usually just overwhelming for the towns because of turnout. This year, we had the highest turnout, not only percentage-wise, but the highest number of people registered to vote ever in the history of the state. So we had to process about 650,000 absentee ballots, where normally we have to process about 5,000 to 10,000. To give you some idea of the difference, it was amazing. But we were able to do it because we sent millions of dollars down to the towns and cities so they could hire extra help. especially in the clerk's offices. And John mentioned that the registrars were done early. We did make some changes to the timeline so that they could open the outer envelope of the ballots earlier. And so anyone who's ever done an absentee ballot knows it is a daunting process. You know, people that complain that there's not enough checks and balances and you can't really tell about absentee ballots, let me tell you, if you can navigate, just getting one is a challenge. You have to apply, then that application has to be sent back. Then you have to get the absentee ballot, then it's got several envelopes involved, and you have to make sure you sign it and this and that. So I would say one of the changes we made and should make, which we don't have, but we could do, is we have to make that application process electronic. It is silly that we have to download the form from the site where you can get it. Anybody can get an application, but you have to download it, print it out, and mail it in. We should be able to do that by email. It's ridiculous. So we could do that fairly quickly, and I hope we can. The other great change I think we made this year were the ballot boxes, those drop boxes, which were real. People are still talking about them because everyone was nervous about the U.S. Postal Service and they weren't sure if they were going to be delivered. So that's another thing that I think was very important this year. We had those ballot drop boxes, which, by the way, again, cannot be used without authority from here on out. That's something that's in a different bill and hopefully will pass. There'll be permanent installations.
I'm sure Tim can tell you. I know from my experience, I used first time in all my career, I'm secretary, even when I was a student at UConn, and I was registered to vote at home, and I used to drive home because I, had that feeling I wanted to vote at my precinct. It was my first few times voting. I was excited.
Right.
So, but this year, with all the new process, I wanted to experience what it was like, and I felt very secure in knowing that having been a registrar, knowing the steps that it takes to cast an absentee ballot, and then actually using that drop box. And as others have said in the past, taking that obligatory selfie of me depositing that ballot into that drop box, I felt it was very secure. And Tim, tell.
Right. Yeah, I used it as well. People forget, but we also did the absentee for the primaries. And I tried to use that as a test case. I mailed that one in, and then I kept checking the state site because you were supposed to be able to go on the state site and verify that they received it. I never got a confirmation that it was received or never saw my name on the list. I just don't think that towns were updating the list for primaries, I guess. But so, yeah, I took advantage of that drop box and felt a lot more secure about it. You mentioned that absentee ballots were used like 5 times more than the previous election. Did that result in greater participation of people? I mean, did our overall turnout increase, or did we just make it easier for existing voters?
Well, I have no empirical evidence to suggest that it's just the absentee ballots that made that happen. It was a complicated election. People were really revved up on one side or another. So, but I can tell you that I do believe if we had not made those changes and made them available to everyone, a lot of people just would not have voted. That's my assumption based on the calls and letters and emails I was receiving. People were scared to go, particularly the seniors. And, I count myself in that group. There's no way they would have gone if it endangered their health. And I felt like they were having to make this terrible choice. And people really care about their vote. And they were literally kind of panicked about it. They're like, how am I going to be able to vote? I don't know. And they don't want to break the law either. And that's what I think we're setting people up for with having it be only a one-time thing. I'm very worried that people are just going to assume they can get it. They're going to check a box that says whatever, or we're going to get hundreds of calls from people saying, well, the box isn't here about that I can check about COVID-19. So what can I do? Can I still get an absentee ballot? And the answer is no. Not unless there's an emergency and COVID-19. So it's going to be very confusing, I think, for people, and in a very bad way.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned one other thing that you brought up, Tim, and that's that ballot tracking system. You asked about other changes we made. We did put in a rudimentary, admittedly, ballot tracking system. If I would like to do one more thing, it would be to have a much more robust ballot tracking system. So people could see exactly where their application was, their ballot was, and we could be sending them text messages or emails to show them. It's really relatively simple to do. We put that one in place in a couple of months. But that would be a very good thing to do going forward. And I have a proposal to do that as well.
I think the feedback that, AARP, we got so involved. I mean, we support these issues as a matter of public policy, and we have supported them in the past. But then, like everything else, the flaws in government got exposed to a greater degree because of the pandemic. And one of the areas was with our inability to actually have as many safe voting options as most voters do in other states. We're always in Connecticut watching the news and seeing people lined up for weeks going in to vote.
Yeah.
And our members were demanding us to work on getting these changes made with your office. And by the way, as you mentioned, nonpartisan, I mean, AARP is completely nonpartisan. We, Legal Women Voters, all these mainstream nonpartisan civic groups that, took this issue on because of the fact that, older folks and, wanted to vote. And, my experience in the past has been exactly what you said, is that, when I was a registrar, I had people I know that were not eligible for absentee ballots telling the registrar that they were going to vote absentee ballot. And, I would have to break the news to them to say, if you don't meet these 5 criteria, you cannot vote that way under the law.
Right.
And, that's an interesting thing. And I think, this is a good education for people. And, hopefully we can get there slowly but surely. I think, the work that you did and how successfully, the town clerks, the registrars in your office oversaw the process is a good thing, because I think, I remember there was so much doom and gloom because some states had, people were confusing mail-in voting with absentee balloting, which is completely different. And, we put this, you were able to get this expansion and done. And I'll tell you, people were very pleased with it. And the feedback we've gotten has been phenomenal about this process, and they want it. And I think, yeah. Well, and the other thing is, Tim, I think the experience for people at the polling place was greater because there was fewer people in the precincts, right?
Right.
And you guys put a lot of precautions in the polling places as well.
All these measures take the pressure off election day. I used to say election day, in a way, is like, I had a daughter that got married, and you know how it is. If you're giving a wedding, everything has to go off perfectly on that one day. And naturally, it never does. There's always errors. There's always a storm, 2 days before. I've had elections where half the polling places were underwater on election day.
Yes.
These things are going to keep happening. But, just as an aside, my daughter's wedding day, we rented a very expensive, huge tent. It was a destination wedding in Vermont. The day of the wedding, the tent collapsed under a huge storm that came in, electrical storm, collapsed the tent, destroyed the dance floor. We had to move everything inside this small area. I mean, it all worked out, but there you go. You just don't know what's going to happen, and you can't.
It's true. That's true, and that's why why it's important. And if I recollect, with the Help America Vote Act, that and going back to those days, that's when states started expanding voting options, with early voting in person, right, because they wanted to take that pressure off election day, based on the experiences of Florida in 2000 and other states. And so, those are great initiatives, and we really appreciate them. So let's talk just quickly about some other initiatives that will help expand voting options. So what is automatic voter registration, and what are the prospects of something like that in Connecticut?
We already have a version of what they call automatic voter registration. And that simply means that when you go to the DMV to either get a license, change your registration, change your address or whatever, you're asked if you want to also register to vote. And they then, if you say yes and answer some basic questions like, yes, I'm a citizen, yes, I'm over 18, you can register right there on the spot. And the beauty of it is it's electronic. So what frequently happens when people fill out those forms and do it on paper, someone has to read their writing. And sometimes it doesn't go that well. Again, that's one of the biggest problems we've always had with our list is, addresses are wrong, or, they're slightly different than what they really are. Someone's name is slightly misspelled and so forth. That has cured so much of all that. And people are actually updating their records. So we do have that now. And I don't know if you've gone to the DMV in the recent past, but that's what you'll see there. And we're able to do it through their electronic signature matching system. So
can you register to vote online, Madam Secretary?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That was one of the first things we put in place when I came in office, was an online system. Takes about a minute. You do still need, for the same reason though, you still need a driver's license or one of those, I don't know, there's some sort of card you can get that's kind of like a driver's license.
State ID card.
State ID card, yeah, which you also get at the DMV. So if you have either of those things, you can register online very simply, or you can change your address. We really encourage people to update their address. Even if you move across town, you may be in a different district. And so you do have to change your voter registration.
That's great. And so what would you say to folks that are out there today about, we talked about, I think the big issues are these constitutional amendments on in-person early voting and no excuse absentee balloting. What would you tell folks that they can do to help get these changes done between now and when the legislature adjourns in June?
Talk to your legislators. They are the ones that are going to have to vote this in large numbers. And heaven knows it's very difficult to get a supermajority of votes these days for anything. But I do think there is significant Republican support. I don't know if it's enough, given the rhetoric of the last election, which was very difficult for us to manage. But I think this one is pretty clear. You heard some objection at the public hearing, so we'll see. But if people want to be helpful, talk to these folks and let them know you want this. We did have a poll that showed that 79% of Connecticut's public want more access to absentee ballots, want days of early voting. They just want more flexibility, opportunities, because not everyone can show up in person on a Tuesday. And that's just the reality of modern life. So it would be very helpful. I know I have many, many advocacy groups like the AARP that are supporting this measure, but you still have to overcome those anxieties that some legislators have, and you just need to let them know, particularly, frankly, the leadership in both the House and the Senate. Kevin Kelly is the new leader in the Senate. I really don't know where he stands on this, but he is an elder law attorney. So I would think he would be pretty tuned into the needs of seniors and the desires of seniors in the state. So I don't know, I'm hopeful that he will support it. And Vin Candelora is the new leader in the House. And he also strikes me as someone who's open to it, at least, and did vote for the early voting measure last time. The early voting measure is a lot easier to get on the ballot in 2022 because it already passed the House and Senate last year. So if we pass it again this year, it's automatically going to go on the ballot.
And that's just if we pass that by a simple majority again, right, we can get that onto the 2022 ballot, correct?
Correct.
And then
that one, I'm fairly confident that will happen.
And then on no excuse absentee balloting, if we don't pass it by 75% in each chamber this year, we have to do it again next year, and then it wouldn't go on the ballot until 2024, correct?
Correct. In fact, not even next year. It has to go back to a separate, different legislature. Yeah. So it'd have to be 2 years from now. We'd have to vote it in again with a different body of legislators.
Right.
Then it goes on the ballot in 2024.
So as you can see, this is a very arduous process, but it's certainly, it's certainly one that we're, it's worth, moving forward on, because as your concerns were right. I mean, people have experienced this. They were happy with it. It was successful. And I think the average person just might not understand all of the hoops that we have to go to in order to get this done. Tim, do you have anything else you want to ask the secretary before
I think I've covered everything.
Well, I certainly have appreciated this conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers this morning, Madam Secretary?
Well, the one thing I would point out is, interestingly, there is some federal action on this whole subject, which might actually supersede our Constitution. I'm not sure. But right now, in fact, next week, I believe, Congress is hearing a bill called H.R. 1, which contains two provisions that are relevant, which is it will require all the states to have days of early voting, and it will require no fault absentee balloting, basically, in every state. So that would help in this case. There are a lot of other provisions in it, and I have no idea where it's going, but there is significant support for it at the federal level. And, you know, let's be honest, it was so confusing when we watched across the country. The rules are different in every state. It is crying out for some kind of standardization. I'm not sure exactly what they're going to come up with right now. I think they're saying 14 days of early voting. That would be a significant change for Connecticut. Sure. So anyway, so you can keep your eye on that and support it if you want to. I haven't really talked to our congressional delegation, but that would be very interesting and certainly short circuit some of this and make it a lot quicker.
Well, Madam Secretary, we at AARP certainly appreciate the partnership we've had with you over the years on many issues, and even going back to your time as the majority leader in the House and as a state legislator. And you've always worked well with us and on issues that are important to older voters in Connecticut. And we do really appreciate you, and thank Tim Ryan, one of our key volunteers in the state of Connecticut, and all of our guests for joining us this morning on our latest installment of Coffee and Tea with AARP, and we look forward to seeing everyone and working with you again. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.